A giant poster of Russian President Vladimir Putin was just draped over a Manhattan bridge, and below the image of Putin were the words, "Peacemaker." Now, some of the witnesses who saw this are completely lost as to what the message meant. Some are saying, "We were all confused about what this is supposed to be saying or expressing. It's not very clear." Another person said, "Nobody understood the political message or whatever message was behind it." And of course, Twitter erupted with a bunch of pictures and comments, like this one here, "Vladimir Putin, peacemaker?" And this one, "Living in some weird and scary times." Well, of course, if you remain apathetic or completely ignorant of world events, or you get your news from the U.S. corporate state media like CNN, well then it's obvious why calling Putin a peacemaker would leave you scratching your head. Now, as the conventional U.S.-led narrative goes, Syria is ruled by a very bad man named Assad, and he needs to go, even if it means nuclear war. Now, fortunately, it hasn't come to that, but in the process of removing Assad, the U.S. has armed, trained, and funded ISIS, and is now on the brink of an all-out war with Russia. So in order to remove a moderate secular dictator like Assad, the U.S. has created one of the most brutal jihadist regimes the world has ever seen. And Russian President Vladimir Putin, who delayed the Syrian war by at least a year by appealing to the individual American sensibilities, is now being completely demonized by Western governments and the media. But Putin has allied himself with Assad in order to prevent ISIS from making any more gains, and the U.S. is clearly not liking this teamwork whatsoever. The U.S., obviously, the ones who backed both sides of the Syrian conflict and provoked Russia in Eastern Europe. And it's the U.S. government who's the ones who are calling Russian bombing campaigns in Syria, quote, barbaric, without any kind of a hint of irony. Never mind the amount of people, including children, who are dead from drone strikes in not only Syria, but also Afghanistan. A joint U.S.-Russian plan to end the Syrian war was also halted when the U.S., quote, so-called accidentally bombed a Syrian army camp, killing up to 100 Syrian troops. And meanwhile, Russian warplanes are doing more to end the conflict in Syria than the U.S. has done since they started this conflict back in 2011. And now Hillary Clinton supporters want a no-fly zone in Syria, which is basically just doublespeak for keeping the Russian warplanes out. Moscow has warned the U.S. not to attack Syrian forces, because the Syrian forces who are being backed by Russian warplanes are making progress in this war-torn country, particularly in the rebel-controlled Aleppo. But meanwhile, the Saudis who are funding this conflict are completely in cahoots with the United States in order to replace Assad's government with the Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front. And of course, the Syrians are completely opposed to being ruled by any radical Wahhabi Islamists. And the U.S. is contemplating direct military intervention into Syria, including sending in ground troops. And Russia is obviously completely opposed to this plan. I mean, since getting involved a year ago, the Russians have pushed back ISIS, they've expanded Syrian control, which essentially ended up helping out the Kurds, who are an ally of Canada's Liberal government. And now, the Chinese are involved. They're backing the Syrian president along with Russia. So, folks, if the U.S. intervenes any further here by sending in ground troops and attacking Syrian military bases, well, the result could be a direct war with Russia and perhaps even with China. So, what's key to remember here in all of this is that it's the United States who started all of these regime changes. They're the ones who started it in Iraq, then moving on to Libya, and now heading into Syria. It's the U.S. who escalates these conflicts. They're the ones who created ISIS, which everyone agrees needs to be wiped out. But while Russia sides with Assad as the lesser evil and makes actual progress, Washington, D.C. is just trying to fight everyone, and the results have been making things much, much worse. And adding insult to injury, this is Russia's backyard. The U.S. is thousands of miles away, and they're protected by two giant moats known as the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. So this would be like if the Russians got involved with a Mexican civil war, and then they demanded that the U.S. butt out of it and just not get involved. So Putin is far from perfect, guys, but in the case of Syria, he is the peacemaker. The U.S. government is the problem, and hopefully things don't escalate into World War III. But seeing that war is big money for bankers and arms dealers, I wouldn't hold my breath. And if Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, you can be sure the chaos will continue. And unlike Trump, who claims to want to negotiate with Russia, Clinton is a neocon war hawk that could lead us into an all-out nuclear war. And all it will take are some U.S. troops in Syria attacking the Syrian military, a move that would aid ISIS, and yet Putin, we are told, is the aggressor here. Well, folks, if you haven't already figured it out, the time is now to turn off the corporate state media and seek out the real truth. You can join us here as a PFT patron. Even just a couple bucks a month will help me greatly in continuing to be able to produce content that you're not going to hear from the mainstream corporate sellout media who receives plenty of financial support to spread their propaganda. Here, all we have is you, so please check the links in the description to find out how you can get involved. And stay tuned, guys. We've got more video reports coming soon. This is Dan Dix reporting for Press for Truth.